we haven't addressed yet.
Can you say who have you spoken to that is telling you that the Senate is going to move legislation? The Senate President has said it's not likely. But
Senator Coley, who is the chair of the Senate committee that has heard Senate Bill 295, said they are planning to take up additional legislation this spring.
Was this in a committee that he made the comments, or just to you directly, or?
It was to a couple of my colleagues who met with him last week. Do you have anything to add?
Also committee. Also in committee.
Did he indicate what was going to be in that bill?
No.
Has he been reaching out to, like, your groups to ask what could be in it?
No, we have tried to find out, in fact, what it is they're planning to address, and we don't know what's in it yet. They have not shared that information, which in and of itself is very endemic of the problem we've had for the last 12 months. The additional handout you have there that talks about the legislation they've been pushing in the last 12 months, they're constantly making changes to it at the last minute before the public has had a time to read and react to it, before voting advocates can provide input, before voters and poll workers and election officials have a chance to weigh in on the impact that this is going to have. And as Sam pointed out, that's not the way to do this.
some of the things they've talked about in terms of changes have been things like bulk purchasing and handicap accessibility. These are things that I think some would argue are not necessarily voting, particularly voting issues. They're more process issues. Are any of those, could any of those issues be addressed, things that would address more of the process and the actual structure of voting rather than the ability to vote?
It's been our experience once you open up Pandora's box, what was started as an innocent change presents an opportunity to do some things that will confuse the process. Even, and I would ask our Representative Mobile to speak to the handicap issues, in the time and preparation and execution of those, what is required, we don't know at this point because we don't know what they specifically are trying to do.
Provisions of House Bill 194 on hold pending the referendum, the outcome of the election. So if they were to come back and repeal it now, it wouldn't change anything about the current process. Is that correct?
Well, you're correct that House Bill 194's provisions are currently on hold pending the referendum. If they were to repeal that, the practical effect would be the same, but there are some unknown legal consequences of that and political consequences of that. It is wholly unprecedented for the legislature to repeal a piece of legislation that is on hold pending a referendum vote. Even the Speaker of the House himself admits there is no legal precedent. They do not know if they have the legal and constitutional authority to do this, whether it's too late to remove it from the ballot or not. These are open questions that are likely to wind up in court, costing the state a lot of money that it frankly doesn't have. So there's that open question. There's also a kind of legal and political aspect to it that's of concern. If the voters reject House Bill 194, it's very difficult for the General Assembly to then go back and reenact those same provisions. If the legislature repeals it, then it's a very different political and legal reality if they try to reenact those same laws, those same provisions later into law.
Politically, even though those precedents that were just articulated, politically it's not a good idea. There's a difference between an initiative and a referendum. A referendum fundamentally is a veto. That's the right of the people to say that we do not support this. Now, by repealing something, you take the right of the people to speak on a specific issue away from them. That's the precedent aspect. And then the question becomes, once you do that, do we then get in a merry-go-round on legislation every time we go out and do petitions? They repeal it, and then we put petitions together, and they repeal it. We don't want to get on that merry-go-round. We don't think it's a good idea. There are legal precedents, but there may be a legal squabble if they attempt to do that, because we don't know what the standing is and what the law says with regards to that. You're taking the people's voice away from them when they've gone through all this work to say, I want to speak on this issue.
So is there any scenario that your groups would support a preemptive repeal?
Right now, our message to the legislature is no more election legislation this year. Whether it's a repeal bill, a replacement bill, anything to do with elections, no more this year. There is enough confusion. There is enough challenge for both voters and election officials to understand what the law is for this year. No more.
We're going, I'll be redundant, we're going into probably one of the most fiercely fought elections on several levels in this state. Reduce the confusion. Let's not have as much confusion because it may affect the outcome. It may affect the interests of voters. It may affect the voters' ability to execute their franchise, which is the right to vote.
And we've come a long way from the problems that we had in the 2000 and 2004 elections. There have been a lot of changes made that have made elections run more smoothly. We haven't had the long lines and the confusion that marred prior presidential elections. We don't want to go back to that. And the more confusion we throw into this election cycle, in the middle of this election cycle, the more likely we are to return to the problems that we saw in 2004.